Why JFK's nuclear policy turned Washington against him. On June 10, 1963, at American University in Washington, D.C., President John F. Kennedy stood before graduating students and delivered a speech that would terrify the most powerful forces in Washington. The speech wasn't cleared by the State Department. It wasn't reviewed by the CIA. It wasn't approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Kennedy's own advisors had kept it secret from the military establishment, fearing they would sabotage it before Kennedy could deliver it. The subject was peace, specifically peace with the Soviet Union through nuclear arms control. Kennedy announced he was unilaterally suspending atmospheric nuclear testing. He praised Soviet achievements in science and culture. He urged Americans to re-examine their attitudes toward the communist enemy, and he declared that no problem of human destiny is beyond human beings, that war wasn't inevitable, that peace was possible, that the nuclear arms race could end. The speech shocked Washington. Defense contractors who profited from weapons production were horrified. Pentagon officials who built careers on confronting the Soviets were furious. Hardline anti-communists who defined themselves by opposing Moscow felt betrayed. Within hours, Republican Senator Barry Goldwater accused Kennedy of taking a soft stance on the Soviet Union. The military-industrial complex realized Kennedy wasn't just pursuing a test ban treaty, he was trying to end the Cold War itself. And 5 months later, Kennedy was dead. If you want to understand how Kennedy's nuclear peace policy made him a target of the very institutions that were supposed to protect America, hit that like button. This is the story of the speech they tried to suppress, the treaty that threatened billions in defense profits, and the president who chose peace when Washington demanded war. Let's start with what Kennedy was fighting against, the nuclear arms race that threatened human extinction. By 1963, the United States and Soviet Union had conducted over 500 nuclear tests. Atmospheric tests, explosions in the open air, released massive amounts of radioactive fallout into the atmosphere. That fallout circled the globe, contaminated rain, entered the food supply through crops and livestock, and accumulated in human bodies, particularly in children's bones and teeth. Scientists detected strontium-90, a radioactive isotope, in the milk supply worldwide. Cancer rates were rising, birth defects were increasing, the planet was being poisoned by nuclear testing. But the health crisis was only part of the danger. Each new test meant more powerful weapons. The Soviet Union had detonated the Tsar Bomba in 1961, a 50-megaton hydrogen bomb, the largest nuclear weapon ever tested, with a fireball 5 miles wide and a mushroom cloud that reached 40 miles high. The United States was developing even more destructive weapons. The arms race was accelerating toward a future where both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization multiple times over. Kennedy understood this. He once remarked at a White House meeting, "It is insane that two men, sitting on opposite sides of the world, should be able to decide to bring an end to civilization." The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 had brought the world terrifyingly close to nuclear war. As Khrushchev described it, the two most powerful nations had been squared off against each other, each with its finger on the button. After the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev began secret correspondence. Both leaders recognized how close they'd come to destroying everything. Both wanted to prevent future crises, and both were willing to pursue peace with the Soviet Union, despite opposition from their respective military establishment. But pursuing peace with the Soviet Union was political suicide in 1963 America. The Cold War had defined American politics for nearly 2 decades. Anti-communism was bipartisan dogma. Politicians competed to prove who was tougher on the Soviets. Any hint of accommodation with Moscow was attacked as weakness or even treason. Kennedy had campaigned as an anti-communist hardliner. He'd criticized Eisenhower for allowing a missile gap to develop, claiming the Soviets had superior nuclear forces. That claim was false,
American nuclear superiority was overwhelming, but Kennedy used it to win the 1960 election. Once in office, Kennedy was expected to maintain that hard line. Instead, Kennedy began moving toward détente, and the nuclear test ban became his vehicle. Kennedy had supported a test ban since 1956, even before becoming president. He believed ending atmospheric testing would reduce radioactive pollution, slow the arms race, and prevent nuclear proliferation to additional countries. In a March 1963 interview, Kennedy said he was haunted by the feeling that by 1970, unless we are successful, there may be 10 nuclear powers instead of 4, and by 1975, 15 or 20.
But negotiations for a test ban had been stalled for years. The main obstacle was verification. The Soviets refused to allow on-site inspections on their territory, fearing Western spies would use inspections to gather intelligence. The Americans demanded inspections to ensure the Soviets weren't cheating. Neither side would compromise. Until Kennedy's American University speech. According to Special Assistant Ted Sorensen, the speech was kept confidential in fear that the unprecedented tone would set off alarm bells in more bellicose quarters in Washington and allow political attacks against Kennedy in advance of the speech. Kennedy deliberately excluded the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, and the State Department from reviewing the draft. He knew they would try to water it down or kill it entirely. On June 10, 1963, Kennedy delivered the speech to American University's graduating class. He called it a strategy of peace. In reality, it was a revolutionary reimagining of America's relationship with the Soviet Union. Kennedy praised the Soviet people. He acknowledged their suffering in World War II, 20 million dead defending against Nazi invasion. He celebrated their achievements in science and space exploration. He urged Americans to recognize common humanity with their supposed enemies. For in the final analysis, our most common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. This wasn't the typical anti-Soviet rhetoric American presidents were expected to deliver. Kennedy avoided the usual vocabulary of gulags and bears. He said, "If we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity." In 1963 America, dominated by anti-communist hysteria, Kennedy's conciliatory tone was shocking. And then Kennedy made his announcement. To demonstrate American sincerity about pursuing a test ban, the United States would unilaterally suspend all atmospheric nuclear testing and would not resume such tests unless another nation did so first. Kennedy was betting that Khrushchev would reciprocate, creating momentum toward a formal treaty. The gamble worked. The Soviet leader welcomed Kennedy's address, which was published in full by the Soviet newspapers Izvestia and Pravda. In July 1963, Khrushchev accepted for the first time a ban on atmospheric testing, which did not require on-site inspections or monitoring stations. This was the breakthrough that had eluded negotiations for years. In July 1963, American diplomat Averell Harriman traveled to Moscow to negotiate the treaty. After only 12 days of negotiations, the two nations agreed to ban testing in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. On August 5, 1963, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in Moscow by the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain. Kennedy claimed that a limited test ban is safer by far for the United States than an unlimited nuclear arms race. But selling the treaty to the U.S. Senate and the American public would be Kennedy's greatest challenge, because powerful forces opposed the treaty with every resource they possessed. First, the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
The military brass viewed the test ban as dangerous appeasement. They believed atmospheric testing was essential for developing new weapons. They feared the Soviets would cheat, conducting secret tests while the United States complied. And they worried that any arms control agreement would reduce military budgets and weaken America's strategic position. General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, was particularly hostile. LeMay believed nuclear war was winnable if America struck first with overwhelming force. He had advocated bombing Cuba during the missile crisis. He wanted to bomb North Vietnam. And he saw the test ban as Kennedy's latest act of weakness that would embolden Soviet aggression. The Joint Chiefs agreed to support the treaty only after Kennedy made significant concessions. Kennedy promised that underground testing would continue without restrictions. He pledged to maintain nuclear weapons laboratories at full funding. He committed to keeping nuclear forces ready for immediate use, and he assured the military that the test ban was a limited measure, not the beginning of comprehensive disarmament. Even with these promises, the Joint Chiefs' support was grudging. They believed Kennedy was naive about Soviet intentions and that the treaty would ultimately weaken American security. Second, defense contractors. Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, and dozens of others profited enormously from the arms race. Every new weapons system meant billions in contracts. Every escalation in the Cold War meant increased Pentagon budgets and guaranteed profits. The test ban threatened that business model. If atmospheric testing ended, development of new thermonuclear weapons would slow. If the test ban led to further arms control agreements, which Kennedy hoped, defense spending might be reduced. The contractors couldn't publicly oppose a treaty framed as protecting children from radioactive fallout, but privately they lobbied senators, funded opposition groups, and spread fear about Soviet cheating.
Third, anti-communist ideologues. These were the people who defined the Cold War as an existential struggle between freedom and tyranny, who believed any compromise with communism was surrender, who saw Kennedy's pursuit of peace as betrayal. Senator Barry Goldwater, who would run for president in 1964 on a platform of military confrontation with the Soviets, led the opposition. Goldwater claimed the treaty would prevent America from developing weapons needed for national defense. He argued that trusting the Soviets was foolish, that they would inevitably cheat, and he portrayed Kennedy as weak, as someone who didn't understand the communist threat. Fourth, and most disturbing, elements within the CIA and military intelligence who believed Kennedy's policies were undermining American security. These officials had built careers on Cold War confrontation. They believed in covert operations, regime change, and supporting anti-communist forces worldwide. Kennedy's pursuit of peaceful coexistence with the Soviets threatened their worldview and their institutional power. These weren't random critics. These were powerful people with access to classified information, control over intelligence assessments, and connections throughout the government. And they viewed Kennedy's nuclear policy as dangerous, potentially traitorous. But Kennedy persevered. Over 2 months, he campaigned for the treaty with speeches, meetings, and public appearances. On September 23, 1963, the Senate approved the treaty by an 80-19 margin. Kennedy signed the ratified treaty on October 7, 1963. It was Kennedy's greatest foreign policy achievement. The treaty banned atmospheric testing, reducing radioactive fallout dramatically. It established a precedent for arms control that would lead to future agreements. And it proved that the United States and Soviet Union could negotiate despite their differences. But the treaty also made Kennedy powerful enemies. And Kennedy wasn't finished. He saw the test ban as a first step toward comprehensive disarmament, toward ending the Cold War itself. In private conversations, Kennedy spoke about withdrawing from Vietnam, normalizing relations with Cuba, and pursuing further arms agreements with the Soviets.
He envisioned a second term free from re-election pressures, where he could fundamentally reshape American foreign policy. The military-industrial complex heard these plans and understood the threat. If Kennedy succeeded in ending the Cold War, defense budgets would be slashed, weapons programs would be canceled, military bases would close, intelligence operations would be reduced, trillions of dollars in future defense spending would disappear. And Kennedy had shown he couldn't be controlled. He'd rejected Operation Northwoods, the Pentagon's plan for false flag terrorism. He'd refused to invade Cuba during the missile crisis, despite military pressure. He'd fired CIA Director Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs. He'd begun withdrawing from Vietnam, despite Pentagon objections, and he'd negotiated the Test Ban Treaty over military opposition. Kennedy was systematically dismantling the Cold War apparatus that powerful institutions had built over 2 decades. And those institutions began to view Kennedy not as a president to be advised, but as a threat to be eliminated. On November 22, 1963, 46 days after signing the Test Ban Treaty, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson became president. Johnson maintained the test ban. It was too popular to reverse, but Johnson abandoned Kennedy's broader peace agenda. Johnson escalated in Vietnam rather than withdrawing. Johnson increased defense budgets rather than reducing them. Johnson maintained Cold War confrontation rather than pursuing détente. Everything Kennedy had planned to do in a second term, comprehensive disarmament, ending the Cold War, reorienting American foreign policy toward peace, died with him in Dallas. Was Kennedy killed because of his nuclear policy? There's no smoking gun, but consider the pattern. Kennedy's American University speech in June 1963 called for ending the Cold War. The Test Ban Treaty in August 1963 was the first step. Kennedy was planning further agreements with the Soviets. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, and Johnson, who replaced him, reversed course on virtually every peace initiative Kennedy had begun. The people who benefited from Kennedy's death were the same people who opposed his nuclear policy. Defense contractors who feared reduced spending, military leaders who wanted escalation in Vietnam, CIA officials who opposed détente with the Soviets, anti-communist ideologues who saw Kennedy's peace efforts as weakness. Let's be explicit about the stakes. The Test Ban Treaty threatened hundreds of billions in defense contracts. Kennedy's plans for comprehensive disarmament threatened trillions. Companies that made fortunes from the arms race faced potential collapse if Kennedy succeeded in ending the Cold War. Would those companies kill to protect their profits? Would military officers kill to maintain their institutional power? Would intelligence operatives kill to preserve the Cold War that justified their existence? History provides disturbing precedents. The Pentagon had proposed Operation Northwoods, killing Americans to justify war with Cuba. CIA had orchestrated coups and assassinations in Iran, Guatemala, and elsewhere. Defense contractors had corrupted politicians and manipulated public opinion for decades. Individually, none of these institutions probably planned Kennedy's assassination, but collectively, they created a climate where Kennedy's removal served multiple powerful interests. Defense contractors wanted him gone. Military brass wanted him gone. Hardline anti-communists wanted him gone. CIA officials loyal to Allen Dulles wanted him gone. And on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was gone. The Test Ban Treaty survived, but Kennedy's vision of peace died. The Cold War continued for another quarter century. The arms race accelerated. Vietnam consumed a generation. Defense spending reached levels Kennedy had tried to prevent. Today, the Test Ban Treaty is celebrated as Kennedy's legacy, but it's worth remembering that Kennedy saw it as just a beginning, not an endpoint. He wanted comprehensive nuclear disarmament. He wanted to end atmospheric testing worldwide. He wanted to prevent nuclear proliferation to additional nations. And he wanted to do what American presidents since have claimed to want but have never seriously pursued: end the arms race entirely. Kennedy faced opposition that subsequent presidents haven't dared to challenge. He confronted the military-industrial complex directly. He chose peace over profit. He prioritized human survival over strategic advantage. And it may have cost him his life. On June 10, 1963, Kennedy delivered the American University Peace Speech. On August 5, 1963, the Test Ban Treaty was signed. On October 7, 1963, Kennedy signed the ratified treaty. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was dead. The timeline speaks for itself. If this story made you question everything you thought you knew about Kennedy's assassination and the forces that opposed peace, do something powerful. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube this suppressed history deserves to reach more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into the presidents who challenged the military-industrial complex. Every day we uncover stories hidden in declassified speeches and forgotten treaties. Stories of presidents who chose peace when Washington demanded war. Of industries that profited from perpetual conflict. And of the price paid by those who dared to end it. True history, true power. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Was Kennedy's peace policy the reason he was killed? Should we know that the Test Ban Treaty threatened powerful interests? Are you in the U.S., Europe, Middle East, Asia? Our community spans the globe. Share your thoughts. Share your city. Keep this conversation alive. Thank you for watching. And remember, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. The speech exists. The treaty is real. Kennedy chose peace. And 134 days after signing the treaty that threatened the military-industrial complex, Kennedy was murdered.
They called it the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Kennedy called it the first step toward ending the Cold War. And the people who profited from that war, the defense contractors, the military brass, the intelligence operatives, got exactly what they wanted when Kennedy died. The arms race continued. Vietnam escalated. Defense budgets soared. And the peace Kennedy fought for remained forever out of reach. June 10, 1963. Kennedy calls for peace. August 5, 1963. Treaty signed. November 22, 1963. Kennedy dead. The question isn't whether the test ban threatened powerful interests. The question is, how far would those interests go to stop the president who threatened them? And after 60 years, we still don't have an answer, because the people who killed Kennedy, if it was a conspiracy, got away with it, and the peace Kennedy died fighting for never came.